Judaism Unbound is supported by Sony Pictures Classics, presenting Between the Temples, a new comedy starring Jason Schwartzman as a cantor losing his voice and possibly his faith, whose world is upended when his grade school music teacher, played by Carol Kane, becomes his new bat mitzvah student. IndieWire raves that Between the Temples is spiky, hilarious, and thoroughly unorthodox. Variety calls it raucous and tender. Between the Temples is now playing only in theaters.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 445, Intermarried Reform Rabbis, no longer banned. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Miriam Terlinchamp.
And all three of us are together today as part of this series that we're doing on weddings to talk about a really specific element of weddings or marriages or relationships that developed a few months ago, which was that the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, that's the ordination center of Reform Judaism, the rabbinical school of Reform Judaism, changed their policies in a way that a number of other rabbinical schools already have. The Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and Hebrew College Rabbinical School and Aleph, the Jewish Renewal Rabbinical Program, and already the Humanistic Rabbinical School was doing that, and probably some others, that they changed their policies so that they will accept a rabbinical student who is partnered with somebody who's not Jewish. And they will also grant ordination to somebody who is partnered with somebody who's not Jewish. We're interested in talking about this for all kinds of reasons, but I wanted to start just by understanding a little bit in the philosophy of, Jewish wisdom. There's a story about Hillel and Shammai and how Jewish practice always went according to the views of Hillel because the school of Hillel was really good at understanding the other side and articulating the other side's position. So I'm wondering if we could put on the table as a starting point the fundamental reason why you would have a policy that says that somebody couldn't be doing those things. Like, what is the mindset that says that a rabbinical student or a rabbi shouldn't be dating, in a relationship with, married, partnered with somebody who's not Jewish? And just to get that launched, I'll just say what I think at least two of the things are. One is that there's some mindset that certainly dominated American Jewish life for most of the 20th century that said just kind of obviously, if somebody's married to somebody who's not Jewish, obviously they don't really take Judaism all that seriously. I mean, how could they? Because if they did, they would want to have a Jewish family where everybody's Jewish. And so, obviously someone like that shouldn't be a rabbi. I mean, why would even somebody like that want to go to rabbinical school? So I think there's kind of a mindset that I think is still out there where people say yeah, this is not really a big problem because it wouldn't even make any sense that somebody like that would want to be a rabbi. And then the other one is this notion that the ideal Jewish family is one where everybody's Jewish. And yeah, there are also lots of other families, and we consider those Jewish families. We consider, one of the important things in the Reform movement is to say that many, many years ago, it changed its understanding of how Judaism is transmitted, that it can be transmitted through either parent, whereas conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism say that it's only transmitted through the mother. So Reform Judaism, I think, might have previously said, hey, those families are Jewish and those people are okay. But it's not the ideal form of a Jewish family, and rabbis should somehow be exemplars of the ideal form of Judaism more broadly, including a Jewish family. And so it's not that we think it's the worst thing in the world, but it's it's not ideal, and we only want to have rabbis who are doing the ideal thing. ? Are rabbis doing the ideal thing in other circumstances? So I think that that's kind of how it goes, at least how I've understood it. And I'm curious, Miriam, as somebody who actually went through the HUC rabbinical program, are there other pieces? Did I get it wrong? What do you think?
No, I think you're right. And I appreciate the invitation for the challenge to think about it this way, because I've been so thinking about the other way for so long. One addition to that is that it comes from an idea that Judaism isn't that sophisticated, that if you marry a Jew, then you'll agree with them on Jewish things, instead of we come from different backgrounds, we might see all the different elements differently. And I think about it in relationship to marriage as a whole, that maybe having that in line would be one less thing to argue about. Being wealthy doesn't change your happiness, but it is one less thing that you don't have to argue about money, that maybe you don't have to argue about what holiday we're at. Instead of thinking, well, maybe we have multiple holidays, and so we get your family on your Christian holidays and go to my family on the Jewish ones. But I think, Dan, you pretty much got it in those ways about being an exemplar. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that exemplar word, I actually a few years ago bought the domain name projectexemplar.com. I still own it. Maybe projectexemplar.org. I'm not sure which. If you go there, it'll say like coming soon. There's nothing there. But I bought it because I was thinking of creating an agitational public facing group that was going to actively assert Jews in interfaith relationships are, in fact, exemplars of what it means to be Jewish in the face of that argument that they can't be, because that absolutely has been the loudest, most central argument. It has been rabbis are supposed to be, quote unquote, symbolic exemplars. That's the precise phrasing that has been used in these conversations. And symbolic exemplar includes what your family looks like. If your family is a mixture, like you said, Dan, both admission to rabbinical school and ordination, the reason why you have to have those two checkpoints is because, of course, somebody could be admitted to rabbinical school with whatever status they are, single, in a relationship, not, and then in the intermediate time, they could potentially date someone, even marry someone who's not Jewish. And then the question is, could they then, if they were admitted, well, then they're in, right? So can they be ordained? In the past, the answer has been no. There's been two checkpoints where you have to not have a non-Jewish partner. One is when you're potentially applying in order to be admitted, and the other is when you are ordained. There has not been anything on the books where if you are dating somebody not Jewish, you like get kicked out, and that opens up a whole other set of conversations.
I think the one sort of clarification too is that it does say when you're signing it that you have to commit that you'll be in a Jewish relationship by the end. So it's easy to sort of say, well, I don't know where this relationship is going. I'm in my 20s, like who knows? And so it doesn't feel quite as hard in the beginning unless you're already married or in a seriously committed relationship. So I think there is, or at least by the time I was going through it, there was a little bit of flexibility on that first gate. The second gate was a hard gate. Then there's no gate once you're ordained, which is, so if you don't marry until after you're ordained, then you can do whatever you want. So it's a weird 5-year stipulation.
So you're not kicked out at that point?
No, once you're ordained, you have your ordination. So you can't
You can't take it back?
They could, I guess, theoretically, but like they have not had a policy where that would be operating. I want to clarify one thing. It's not that by the end of your time in rabbinical school and you have to be in a relationship with a Jew. It's that you need to not be in a relationship with a non-Jew. I've voiced that very loudly in the past because this policy has asserted very straightforwardly that it is better to have no romantic relationship whatsoever. And by the way, it's fine to have no partner. There are polyamorous folks who have multiple partners. How they are affected by this policy is actually not clear. But like this policy has asserted that if you have no partner ever in your life, you can and should be an exemplar of Jewish living. If you have a non-Jewish partner, you are not. And that I've always mentioned that because they are in effect saying to people like me and others with non-Jewish partners that it would be better for us to have no romantic partner at all in terms of our leadership of Judaism. So that I am thrilled is no longer operating.
As somebody who's like never really wanted to go to rabbinical school, even though I'm married to someone who's Jewish, it's an interesting position to be in having this conversation because I could be admitted but have no desire to. And actually, like, I think that that's the point that I want to talk about here because while, of course, this is really super sad for people who want to be rabbis and specifically wanted to be Reform rabbis and couldn't be admitted to rabbinical school, that's a pretty small number of people in the scheme of things. The much larger number of people is the people who are being told through this policy that they're living in a suboptimal way Jewishly. And it's interesting to me that they didn't have this policy that you have to be in a relationship with someone or something along those lines, because obviously, like, folks who think that there is a exemplar optimal way to have a Jewish family tend to think that not only should you be married to someone who's Jewish if you're married, they say you should be married, that that's an exemplary, ideal way to have a Jewish family. So it's interesting that they didn't have a policy that said that it kind of wasn't okay for rabbis to be unmarried or unpartnered. And I guess, like, implicitly what they're saying there is not only is a family where you're not married to a Jew not ideal, not exemplary, it's much worse than another unexemplary form where you're not married at all, you don't have a family at all. That's a piece that really kind of shows you that this policy was really harsh in its view of what the people out there who were married to non-Jews were in the scheme of things, even though the Reform movement had made a policy many decades ago that the kids would be Jewish in those families. So it's really kind of fascinating to me.
I think you're right on exactly, Dan. I do think it's worth a caveat of the implicit policy that existed. And even though you didn't have to explicitly say you're going to be married, as somebody who was single during my ordination year and into my first years of my rabbinate, it was so hard to interview for jobs. And when you're interviewing in a rabbinate, you don't have the same rights that other people do in your job interviews. They can ask you about your age. They can ask you about your children plans. They can ask you whatever they want. And every single interview that I had asked about the status of my family, the status of my relationships, and not in the sweet, like, well, tell us, do you have a partner? And what do they do? It was, we are a community that values family. And therefore, we want to know how you're going to reconcile this. And I was like, are you offering something here? I'm not quite sure what's going on. And so I think they couldn't require people to be married because you're trapping people in marriages. You're doing all kinds of like really problematic things. And I don't think it's changed that much in this 20 years since I applied to rabbinical school about that value. I think it's different depending on gender, what they expect. But absolutely, you're in that final year of school and they're doing the professional development and supporting you and what you're going to look like as a rabbi in the congregational world. And the message is loud and clear. Your life will be worse if you are single. And then it asks the question, if you're single in the rabbinate, how are you going to do this job? Because the job in the congregational world is really, really hard and does require a second or third or fourth pair of hands to help meet all the expectations. So it wasn't in writing, but it sure was there.
That's really important to name. And I think that the difference between implicit and explicit policy, not just on this issue, but in general, is really worth noting here, because like we've talked about this with other issues, right? Like there are plenty of organizations that don't have written policies about what people can think about Israel or whatever, but still there are implicit understandings in a lot of organizational contexts where if you approach things in way X, that is not going to fly for a staff member of the organization or for a board member of the organization or for a member of the organization in different respects. So I don't want to suggest that HUC was like totally fine to people that were single. I'm glad that it never manifested as a policy where you have to check a box on an application that says, I will be partnered because we believe in the value of romantic partnerships. And like, it really gets to like conservative family values arguments very quickly, which I think people know. I think they understand that, but they don't want to say it because in a reform context, they're not conservative. Like, there's a reason why the movement is differentiated from conservative Judaism. Even in conservative Judaism, they'll try to distinguish between being lowercase conservative in the like political sense versus capital C conservative in the Jewish sense. But like decades ago, the reform movement and all of the major movements of American Judaism hated intermarriage. They hated it. They hated it publicly. They hated it privately. They had committees convened together to make it not happen. They thought not only that it was a bad way to live Jewishly, but that it was an exit from Judaism. Marrying out was like, we've lost this because the way that folks opposed to intermarriage make their arguments has shifted because what works as an argument has shifted. But like the original thought behind all this is that intermarriage could extinguish the Jewish people. That not only is this sort of not great, not exemplary, to use that exemplar word again, that it is it is violence against the Jewish people. People regularly, publicly, in sermons, in articles, everywhere talked about this as comparable to Hitler. The way that Hitler's work is completed is through intermarriage. Like, it's not fun to talk about this, but we have to say it, that the Reform movement, the Reconstructionist movement, the Hebrew, like that none of these organizations have really reckoned with. And there's still reverberations, ripples of that, even as the arguments have softened. And so like, I feel like we need to say, because there are clear questions of like cognitive dissonance, right? Like, how could a movement that is liberal, capital L liberal, and most of its people don't think about family values and all that, like, why were they aboard this policy? I think a lot of people hear about and their first reaction is confusion. Why? Like the reform movement, they're not even coming at this from Jewish law. Like there was a question, Dan, earlier about like where they're coming from on their arguments. it's important to say the reform movement, by and large, they're not making the arguments that some in the conservative movement are, which is that, well, Jewish law in the Talmud and later codes says a certain set of things, and therefore intermarriage can't really be supported. Like, they're not making that argument because that's not how the reform movement makes most of its judgments about how to practice Judaism. But they are making a set of like sociologically based arguments that did and continue to do a lot of damage. And the core of this policy was that interfaith marriage was not only seen as less than ideal, it was seen as a threat to Judaism. And the people doing it were marked as adversaries. Their participation in Jewish life was seen as risky. It was actually bad if interfaith families were able to be participants in Jewish life, were able to be rabbis, were able to do these things, even if they wanted to. It links to the fact that in the 70s, the Reform movement, along with the Orthodox and conservative movement, banded together to get a TV show pulled off of CBS because there was a happy interfaith couple in it. They said in New York Times articles to the entire world that featuring a happy interfaith couple in public is a threat to the existence of the Jewish people.
That's Bridget Loves Bernie for folks who want to look it up, right?
Yeah. And we'll put the articles, there's multiple articles about this. There were death threats. People called CBS executives. There was a campaign across Jewish movements, including the Reform movement, actually, as far as I can tell, maybe most loudly the Reform movement. That's where this is coming from. And that's why I'm celebrating. This is not just that we changed a rabbinical school policy. This is that we have come to a place as a Jewish community where the flagship of the most loud manifestation of the progressive Jewish world, which is the Reform movement, that community has said being in an interfaith relationship does not disqualify you from being a model of being Jewish. That is a way to be Jewish. It is not a way to leave Judaism. And that has been needed for an incredibly long time.
I think that the way that you've just been describing the situation of intermarried folks or interpartnered folks relates to the way that the rabbinical schools treated LGBTQ folks until relatively recently, where those policies were initially in place because people were homophobic and they actually disliked homosexuality and they thought it was a bad thing to do. That's why people weren't admitted to rabbinical schools that were gay 50 years ago. At some point, they probably changed, for most of the people changed their view on that. And they said, it's not that we hate these people, we love them. And it's not that we feel homophobic necessarily, but it's not the ideal kind of a Jewish family. And rabbis should be exemplars of the ideal form of Jewish families. And that's why we shouldn't have LGBTQ rabbis. And there were also other reasons. And then eventually that fell away as well, similar to this. But the larger point that I wanted to make is I think that this is kind of how I've been thinking about Jewish rituals in general, Jewish practices in general, that kind of don't make sense anymore. That if we look at their origins, often their origins are in something that we actively don't like. It could be misogyny, it could be a belief in God that we don't hold anymore. Not that we don't believe in God, but that we don't believe in the God the way that practice seems to. But there was a sense that when this practice originally arose, it arose in a context that we profoundly feel different from now. When that tends to happen, when that's recognized, a lot of people's first response is, okay, well, we have to retain the practice, but we'll do it now for a new reason. We'll give it a reason that is less objectionable. You can do that, and sometimes you can do that really beautifully, but often you do that, but it actually continues to retain the problematic elements that it had initially. And I think that gender roles is a great example of that. There's all kinds of things that you could say, well, originally women couldn't count in a minyan because we actually didn't value women. Then later they say, well, we do value women, but the practice is not to count women in a minyan. So now it's because we honor that they have a different role in the family and blah, blah, blah. And the truth is that what we should do is just not have that practice anymore because it's inherent with misogyny in that particular case. And it's a good thing that liberal Judaism has dispensed with that. And I think that I'm advocating for a broader approach in Jewish life that says, hey, you know what? It seems cool to retain these old practices and give them new meanings. And sometimes that is wonderful and beautiful, and I'm the biggest supporter of that. but we should look at everyone individually and say it's also okay to reject it altogether if it turns out that it no longer meets our values, or even worse, in the case that we're talking about here, that it's actually in opposition to our values and is harming people. When that happens, we should get rid of it and not feel bad that we're, breaking the chain of tradition. Like, it actually is the chain of tradition, in my opinion, to try to fix Judaism so that it stops harming people.
I think you're right, Dan. And I think that if we were going to ask HUC or any other institution that has changed its values or changed its policies to map against its values, then something is really missing from this moment, which is an apology to Shuva, acknowledging, like, just listening to Lex. I wanted to say, can we just push pause for a second and breathe? But also, you can't speak that strongly against something unless you have been impacted by it, I think. And to have said, we're lifting a prohibition is not the same as saying, we love you, we celebrate you, and we're so excited. I think a lot about how same gender policies have changed in our country, and that by the time it was legalized, 61% of Americans believed we should have it. And so what changed was not the policy. What changed is that the people wanted it. And I think that was what happened too. We were like, okay, you created these rules. Well, fine. We trust people to know what Judaism has to offer them. And they're doing that and marrying other people because they love them. I guess I wish along with that statement, they had said, I'm sorry for the pain it created. I'm sorry for limiting the leadership in our communities. And I'm sorry also for not seeing the communities that exist right now that are diverse for what they are. And I'd hope that it would then connect to the next, like they could see the future and go, you know what, this other policy, I'm also going to lift this one at the same time, like to like pay it forward a little bit, or to like have a consequence that was just like, and now my gates are going to open just a scooch bigger than I'm uncomfortable with, because it shouldn't have been that uncomfortable to lift a prohibition. Like, that was just time. And to watch the outpouring of pain around it makes it hard to celebrate.
Yeah, I will say I've been vigorously celebrating. I agree with what you just said. And one of the biggest problems, probably the biggest problem with this policy and why it has been able to do so much damage, is in my view that people haven't known it exists. And so this policy was operating and preventing actual people from going to rabbinical school. And it was sending the message that I was just talking about to Jews generally. But people didn't know it existed, because it's not as if the reform movement was like, hey, everyone, we ban folks in interfaith relationships. But like, I do get really revved up, and I have found historically that naming matter-of-factly but passionately the ways in which this has harmed me, this has harmed tons of my friends. I mean, over the years, I've had probably, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, I've had like 50 conversations with unique individual people who wanted to go either to HUC or before that, these other schools, but couldn't. And so we were sort of a mixture of strategizing what they should do with their lives. Should they go to one of the schools that they were permitted to? Should they not become a rabbi? Should they hide their romantic partnership? All of those questions. And it was a mutual support system. What I want to turn to, though, is like, Miriam, you and I in different ways are actually examples of how this policy affected real life people. And I think it's worth naming those in addition to the symbolic message it sent to the Jewish world. For me, I was somebody who grew up in the Reform movement. I eventually, after all of my friends were calling me rabbi before I wanted to be, and I would yell at them, and I didn't want to be a rabbi, I eventually was like, oh, I want to go to rabbinical school. And that's when I learned I couldn't. I had spent a lot of time not wanting to do the thing. And then the second I'm interested, I got slapped in the face by a policy that said that because I'm dating at the time, I wasn't yet married, but I was dating my now wife, that I couldn't go. My path is a happy ending in many senses. I found a good fit with a different school, with Aleph, that never had a policy like this, and that actually ordained somebody in the 80s who was in an interfaith relationship. I believe the first person ever. We don't it's not even a stat. It's not even a talking point in historical conversations about the rabbinate, because we haven't seen it as like something to be proud of yet. And I'm a moderately happy version of this story, which is that I lost a lot of sleep and had a lot of terrible days where I realized that the Jewish world thinks that my family is not an approvable version of a family. But I got to be a rabbi through a less well-known, non-accredited rabbinical school. Other people don't have that ending. They end up not being a rabbi, holding a lot of pain about it, sometimes, in my view, rightfully distancing themselves from the Jewish communities that did them harm. Others connect closer to the communities that did them harm to try and change them. But like, I'll put that in the pot, and then Miriam, you can bring your personal story on that.
Sure. For me, rabbinical school was always my Nineveh. Maybe like Dan, who protests too much about rabbinical school. For me, it was something that was always like calling and looming. And when it came time to apply, I actually was deferred. I was deferred the first time when I applied to HEC. I grew up conservative, and they said, "You're too traditional, Miriam. You need to go back and absorb the ways of the reform world and read all these books." And I learned in that process that what the rabbinate asks of you is to conform to a set of ideas and metrics and the way we go in the world. And I don't say that with a negative way. Like, if you're going to preach a certain way in the world, or you're going to lead a certain place, and you're going to affiliate with a denomination, it makes sense that there are guardrails to that. And so I learned them, and I was accepted. And when it came time to check that box, I thought it was one of the many things that I had to do to say, like, well, optimistically, I'll agree with that. Sure, someday. When I checked that box, I was in a committed relationship with a non-Jewish person. And that person came with me to my year in Israel and lived with me during that time. And everybody knew them. And the person was from East Berlin. And so it was like very clear that this person hadn't been raised in a Jewish community. And all my professors knew and accepted. And they would occasionally say, "Hey, Miriam, by the end of this." And rabbinical school is long. It's 5 years. And so I will say, but because of this policy, I think we have brought 3 new Jews into the world just through me. I was like, okay, guys, we have to go jump in the lake, or we have to go to the mikvah. And because even after I was ordained, I've always been interested in people who think differently than me and see the world differently than me. And that means people who are raised differently than me and see God differently than me. And I felt that even after I was ordained, that my colleagues also wanted that of me, that we all sort of did that from each other, and that's what success would look like. So I don't know if it was painful for me in the same way. It was something that I thought was expected of me. It took a long time in the rabbinate to set that down, not just the interfaith piece, but all of the pieces that in order to serve your community, you have to serve it through this one lens and this one way. I hope that HUC and the reform movement expand more and create more leaders who aren't restricted the way that many of us were when we went to school.
I really appreciate you bringing that in. And this is probably intuitive to our listeners, but like, you're not at all alone. There were many people who, when faced with that decision of, do I check the box on the application saying I don't have a non-Jewish partner? Do I answer dishonestly on this application because I do have a non-Jewish partner? Do I hide that? Or do I check the box and understand that I'm not going to be able to go to this school? What I want to say last on this policy is that, like, there's a need that's being met. People in the world need to have religious leaders that share their life experiences. This is intuitive to us on every other topic. Like, we need to have queer rabbis because queer Jews need to have folks who share their life experiences or can understand or resonate with their life experiences. They need to have those folks not just like permitted in Jewish spaces, but at the front of those spaces. People with disabilities need to have folks who are rabbis. We could go down every angle. Like, we need rabbis that look like the broader Jewish population. This idea that rabbis should be a segmented out group that only represent the exemplary. Like, first off, I hate the idea that we're picking and choosing between human beings, families, and life experiences and saying that one or even a group of them are exemplary and others aren't. Like, what a weird move. Like, we should presume that different ways of living in the world are by and large holy and sacred, and then have rabbis that come from each of those places and can speak to those people's life experiences. Like, I often officiate intermarriages because people say to me, like, Lex, there were other people in my life who like would do an intermarriage, right? But the fact that you are in one yourself felt like, oh, like, we'll be able to ask you things that we might not be able to ask the other rabbi. Like, that's meaningful. This is a form of leadership that we've needed. And now it's not that interfaith families will be able to find rabbis that like won't not do their life cycle events. It's that they will be able to find people who have actively inhabited the same kind of life cycle events that they have. That's going to make for better wedding ceremonies. It's going to make for more beautiful baby namings. It's going to make for incredible bar mitzvahs and everything in between. And also, when we get to the things in the Torah that talk about inter-ethnic, inter-tribal relationships, we'll have folks at the front of the room that can speak about those from their own life experience. Like, how amazing is that we now have that and we haven't before?
Well, I definitely think it's very amazing, and I want to underscore that I personally believe it's very amazing. I do want to continue to ask a little bit in the voice of another point of view, or even a little bit to explore it within our point of view, just to say that I don't want to undersell what we're saying here, because I think that what we're saying is that there is a view of what Judaism is and what Judaism does that I think the three of us share, and I think a lot of our listeners share, which is quite different from the view of what Judaism is and what Judaism does of the people that have been advocating for the other position. And I want to take them seriously within their own worldview, in the sense that I want to honestly say to them, I think what we're doing here is a new take on Judaism that I think is a better take. I think it's a more appropriate take to the times in which we live. What I'm trying to say is, in a world, if you believe that Judaism really is about the preservation of a very particular people with a very particular way of life, then I can see the argument that says we have to hold the line. We have to say, and maybe they made a mistake in not understanding, not realizing that a family with intermarried people could be that kind of family. But I could see a world in which they're saying, it's yeah, Lex, I see what you're saying about, obviously, if you're going to be marrying someone that's not Jewish, you would love to have a rabbi who's married to someone who's not Jewish, because that makes you feel that you are legitimate, but they're saying, but that's not legitimate. In other words, and I think that we should really be clear that we don't agree with that. It's not that we don't agree with it practically. It's saying no, we're actually talking about a different kind of Judaism. And the way that I interpret what kind of Judaism that is that I say, the Judaism that I want is a Judaism in which the material of Judaism is helping people live better lives. And that, I think, will form a new community around the people for whom Judaism is helping them live better lives. That's what will create and hold and have a continuous community, is that if Judaism's really doing that, then people are going to opt into it because it's so awesome. And that's the Judaism that I want. I don't really want a Judaism that is inherited by matrilineal or patrilineal or whatever, that it's kind of in the blood in some kind of another. I want a Judaism that people are opting into because it's working for them. And I think that in that paradigm, you're in a way, Lex, flipping the exemplar thing on its head, because one of the questions that I really wanted to ask the two of you in this conversation is, this whole notion that a rabbi should be an exemplar, is that even part of the rabbi's role? Should it be? That feels like kind of an idea that doesn't need to be. We could say, when I have a doctor, I don't think of my doctor having to be an exemplar of health. It's nice if the doctor is healthy, but the fact of the matter is that the doctor's role is to help me be healthy. And if the doctor, is eating unhealthy foods, but whenever I meet with them, the doctor tells me to eat healthy foods, I think that's okay. So we could talk about the rabbinic role, but I thought what you said, Lex, was really interesting about how, in a way, you do want rabbis to be exemplars. You want rabbis to be exemplars of a wide variety of ways of being Jewish. And actually, those rabbis are going to be more effective with the people who want to be Jewish like them because of that sense of feeling someone like me is a rabbi, and I think that there is this sense, I don't want to say it's completely ridiculous what was being said in the past, because I do think that there's an element that once rabbis are marrying people that aren't Jewish, I'm not saying that it is an exemplar that people will say, oh, the ideal is to marry someone who's not Jewish, but it certainly would be the case, I think, that people would say to their parents, if their parents said to them, hey, you shouldn't marry someone who's not Jewish, they're like, but the rabbi is. Mm-hmm. In that sense, there is a power to a world where rabbis are intermarried. I think that that's really going to change the plausibility structures for young Jews in ways that I think that those other people that are against this change, I think that they intuit that, and I think that they're right to. So there is a power of exemplarism of rabbis, and I guess I would say that's a good thing. In other words, I would say that that I'm hoping that this change will open up possibilities of how to be Jewish, but I also understand the fear of those other people. Maybe rabbis are exemplars. I guess I go back to that question of like, what do you think about this whole exemplar business?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear Miriam on this. The brief thing I'd say is that I meant to convey mostly that I don't think rabbis specifically should be exemplars. There's the prescriptive and the descriptive. What should rabbis mean in the world and what do they mean? And I think on this issue, I'm constantly oscillating between the two. When you're doing advocacy, you have to think about the material realities of now and the hoped for realities. But like my hoped for reality that I meant to convey is that rabbis, by and large, are not seen as exemplars, quote unquote, in the sense that they are different from, that they should be a kind of Jewish that is specific. And so people can look at rabbis and be like, oh, that's the kind of Jew. Like, I don't think rabbis should be seen that way. And I think to the extent rabbis are exceptional from the rest of Jews, we should be spreading out leadership where rabbis are not the ones always at the front of the room, but rather it's spread among everyone. And I do think that descriptively, it is the case that people do look at rabbis and say, that is a plausible kind of Jew to be in a deep way. And they do it more with rabbis than they do with really Jewy Jews that aren't rabbis. I'd like them to do it with the really Jewy Jews that aren't rabbis. And I don't mean by that people that are like involved in synagogues. I mean like every kind of really Jewy Jew. Like I wish people were like, oh, my friend is a nerd and reads a ton of Jewish books and is in a bunch of digital Jewish communities. And so like they do a thing. And so that means that I can do that as a Jew. They don't do that usually. They usually say, well, rabbis are that thing. And so I can be that thing. But I would like to build the world where the exemplar notion, like I was going to buy projectexemplar.org, not because I think rabbis in interfaith relationships are exemplars, but because I think people in interfaith relationships are exemplars.
I agree with everything you're saying around having a multitude of identities and ways of being Jewish. Dan, I think it's like really sweet that you're open about your doctor, but I totally judge them inside. I'm like, I don't know. You told me to run. Maybe you should be running. And maybe it's a self-defense mechanism. But I think if you go to 4 years of undergrad and then 5 years of rabbinical school and have the mountain of debt, you walk away, I think for a lot of us from that education, that you are an expert. Maybe you're not a great expert or you're an expert at some part of it, and that you don't get to choose whether people see you as an exemplar or not. You just don't. One thing I have found true is that people will work very hard to keep you humble, and they work very hard to put you on pedestals that you did not earn. Like there's nothing sort of earned in that process. And so I think the only thing you can do is to walk the talk and actually to embody what you learned in school. And I think that in that case, it's around your moral compass. Like, are you following that? And it has really nothing to do with policies and all those different parts. But I think that if you're a rabbi and you're really not such a good human and you're not caring for the poor, you're not seeing yourselves and others, and you're not accompanying people in times of light and dark, then you're not doing your job and you're not exemplary. There is something that is inherent to that post or to that title that is problematic and also is to our benefit. And I will say that the biggest change for me from going from, almost 2 decades of congregational work to this job as an executive director is that I have my name back. Like I get to be Miriam for the first time in a really long time, and to settle back into my humanity and to not try to defend and say, no, really, I am human, but to actually be seen by that because that's the name that they're calling me.
As opposed to Rabbi Miriam or Rabbi Turlington.
Yeah, well, I hate Rabbi Miriam, but yes. Yeah, that the rabbi meant that they were going to talk to me and see me in a certain way. And I was always like trying to meet that need and that pressure to meet that need and fit their expectations. And maybe this is like a woman thing too. I don't know what it is, but it was crushing. It was crushing to try to meet what people thought of me. And so maybe when we lift these prohibitions and we expand who's an exemplar and get to have all different faces, it also lets the rabbi set down their title a little bit. And I do think that there will be a democratized Judaism fairly soon. I think that that's part of what we envision here in this organization, that there is a wilderness of people who want to set down their title and build a world through gifts. In the meantime, I think that, yeah, you got to own your title and what's behind it.
I want to ask both of you about this question of teshuvah, repentance, because I kind of have mixed feelings about it in the sense that I know, Lex, full stop, you're celebrating. So putting that as a given, I'm curious, like beyond the celebrating, whether you think that in this case, that the Hebrew Union College should do teshuvah. And I think what that would look like would be to make a declaration of some kind that we're sorry about two things. We're sorry for all the rabbinical candidates over the history of our institution, the last century, that could have been great rabbis, but that we didn't admit and that weren't able to be rabbis. And we are sorry for them because we caused them harm. And the other, I think, bigger apology is due to the people, the Jewish people out there, that our policy over the years implicitly said we're not living ideal, exemplary Jewish lives, and that hurt them. We are really apologizing for that. And the reason why I have mixed feelings about it, in that I'm not sure if I care or not, is that what I want to say to all those people that were harmed is come along with us. We're here in the wilderness creating this new group that's going to try to find a new way to be Jewish without those harms. The reason why you kind of want that apology, we're asking for an apology from kind of the old school folks, who are not coming along with us yet. We hope that they will eventually. If they were to give that apology, if they were to do that tshuva, and the result would be that more people would connect to them, would say, oh, great, well, the reform movement is great, we're back, everything's fine, then I would be like, those people are actually looking for something new, and just kind of putting things right on this particular issue won't actually solve the problem. It'll continue because it's not just about this one issue. It's about a whole set of issues that ultimately, that's not what the kind of mainstream Judaism is about. So I think, of course, I think that HUC should do that tshuva. My question is kind of like, do we care whether or not they do?
I'm really glad you're asking this because I do care very strongly. It's funny, this gets to what is teshuvah. This gets to what is repentance. And I feel very strongly that teshuvah is not a tool in the toolbox to get something. In this, and I'm not saying you said this, but to the extent anybody would ever do teshuvah as part of a PR effort, to the extent that that HUC or anybody else would apologize for past actions because their sense is that it will get people to participate in their work moving forward. I don't want to say I oppose it. I don't oppose that. I just don't think it's good. I think that teshuvah, in order for it to be actual repentance, is not about winning. It's not about getting something moving forward. It's it is looking at something from the past that I or my organization did wrong and naming that it was wrong and committing to not do it moving forward. That's not saying to people, oh, you thought we were bad, now we're good, and so you should come to our rabbinical school. I'll be honest, I got a note from somebody that said hey, Lex, here's the link to refer people to our rabbinical school. And I was weirded out. I'm not waking up, I'm celebrating absolutely this shift, but my reaction is not oh, HUC's good now. And everybody in individual relationships, I'm now going to tell them to go to that school. I wouldn't want to go to a school where a bunch of my teachers just last year argued against something to change and lost, right? Some of the teachers on that faculty argued against this change and lost the fight. That would be a tough situation for me to go in. Other people may choose to go into that situation. But I think that teshuvah needs to be done. But the other thing I'd say is it shouldn't just be HUC. The reason why I think HUC and also before them, why RRC, the Reconstructionist School, why Hebrew College, none of them, to my knowledge, have ever done a public-facing apology for the damage that their policies did. And I think part of why they haven't done that is because there are PR notions that basically public apologies don't serve you, and that you, especially when you do something good, you focus on, oh, we're doing this good thing. You don't focus on how you used to do a bad thing. Do I think Hebrew College, RRC, and HUC banding together and doing a public-facing article for Yom Kippur this year, I would like them to do that. I actually think now is the time for them to do that. I think those three schools, now that they have all changed their policies and they could look at this and say, we were doing harm, there are reverberations of it still, but we're not doing that specific harm anymore. We apologize, we regret it, and here are the ways we're committing to be different moving forward. I think now is the time. Because if it were RRC doing it before, it would look like they're trying to flex that they're better than the other ones. At this point, there's 3 schools that all made a shift. They could do this together, and they could send the message that we harmed the Jewish people. We were harming our own organizations because there were good, qualified people that we didn't welcome. But we actually sent a message to the broader world that is not about any one of our organizations. That would be the point where I start to consider pointing people to these places as really exemplary places that folks could become spiritual leaders, because they would be modeling what it means to reflect and do teshuvah. That's why I do care. I want them to do that. And look, I still think people should be looking to unbound, outside the box kinds of organizations. I went to a rabbinical school, Aleph, that never had this policy. I think people should be more aware of schools off the beaten path like that. And it's got to be about the benefit of everybody involved and not the benefit of any particular sub schools or of thought or sub like theories of change in Jewish life.
I agree with you, Lex. It would be a beautiful thing to see this Yom Kippur. And I also think it's never too late to just publicly say sorry for this thing that I've done or I was part of. I think that HUC has done a really good job apologizing fairly recently for assaults, harassments, and having tangible actions that they've done to help repair these wounds that have happened on their campuses. I think that they have been exemplary, actually, in restitution and figuring out what it means to change. And as much as I'm like, yes, come join us in the wilderness, I think that is for a certain kind of person, right? When you take that pill during the Matrix and you're like, I'm going to go off the Matrix, and it still means that you can't like enjoy all the benefits that it's part of mainstream work, and that not everyone can do that or wants to do that or is capable of leading in that space or learning in that space. And so I'm really thankful for the people who continued, for the people who are willing to sort of fight for it from within and believe that change is possible from within. And I think that probably to stay in it, that there needs to be some kind of atonement, but that sort of celebrating this moment for what it is and then say, okay, and now what? If all of us are on the outside, then there's no one saying now what from the inside. I remember the dean of HUC when I was in school, Rabbi Richard Levy of blessed memory. He pulled me into his office. I think it was like year 3. And he's like, Miriam, we really love you. We think that you're great. And we also think that what should I say? You're a lone wolf. And we want you to do more things with your community members. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? And he wanted me to join a dance midrash class, which was like not on brand for Miriam Cherlin Champ at the time, nor is it currently. And it was like this beautiful outreach of, I'm trying to see you. I'm missing the mark on what it means to see you. But what I want you to do is to believe that the people in this room are your chevre. And then they moved a easel into the sanctuary because I was really intensely, I really believed in the worship and being part of it. But I drew all the time and I painted all the time. They said, why don't you do that in this space? And like they tried to expand themselves and, it wasn't perfect. And it worked for me because I believed at the time that my job was to serve in a more mainstream space. Now I think it would be really hard for me to go backwards. But I think like holding the yes and there of like, we're trying. And also like for those of us who are like Lex and just can go straight to the wilderness and find the other ways, like Zagazont, that's wonderful. The 3 of us are here waiting for you with open arms if you want to come this way. But also in the meanwhile, I don't want to, let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of atonement and change.
I guess the only thing that I want to say to you, Lex, is like just to have you think about and also our listeners think about, like, what if you had gotten into HUC back then? Like, there would be no Judaism Unbound podcast probably. In a way, I think that the Jewish people is better off that you didn't go there. And that's like a hard question to ponder.
Yeah, I agree with that. What's funny is I don't think I ever would have ended up there. I hear you. I think that with other people, that alternative universe question is real. Like, it is maybe a great thing that folks end up in more liberated places. I did want to give us a little bit of like a trailer, a sneak preview of some of our upcoming episodes that are diving into joyous weddings. What's funny is this policy both is and isn't about like weddings, right? It's about romantic relationships and how they intersect with Jewish leadership. It's not really about weddings, and weddings theoretically are when we establish, honor, celebrate couples who have come together, whether they're Jewish or Jewish and something else or fully something else. I'm just like sitting with my joy, again, that through this policy shift, there will be a bigger sample size of folks able to officiate the, 70+% of current Jewish weddings that are interfaith who themselves have had an interfaith relationship. And to be clear, I don't think that folks in intra-faith relationships or folks who are single are unable to officiate such ceremonies. But I think there are many people who want folks who vibe with their lived experience. And so in 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to have a generation of Reform ordained clergy who are in interfaith relationships. We've already got a growing cohort of folks from other movements. I mean, it's in my own time as a rabbi, which is only 3 years, the amount of people who are in interfaith relationships who are rabbis has grown a great deal. That's exciting. And so getting to turn to the question of what changes about other communal questions when this changes? Dan, you always cite that amazing Talmud passage about how once you open up the gates of the classroom to one type, there's a story in the Talmud where they let in a certain set of folks, and the first thing they do is call for the gates to be opened to another group of folks. I think that doing this will have a reverberation in terms of how many Reform clergy are willing to co-officiate weddings. Right now, the reality is most Reform rabbis are in a specific situation, which is that they do officiate interfaith weddings, but they require them to be Jewish exclusive ceremonies. I mean, maybe not most. That's in my experience with Reform rabbis, the most common situation is that they'll officiate with a couple that is, one is Jewish and one isn't, joyously. And if that couple wants to be co-officiated by a rabbi and a non-Jewish clergy from some other religious tradition, they may not be willing to do it. And so I believe that once you have actual clergy, like me, selfishly, who have had co-officiated weddings, and you realize that doesn't mean you don't care about Judaism or you somehow are not committed to it, that will start to reverberate too. And so I'm excited for these other episodes where we can sort of envision together what can continue to change in the new kind of Judaism. I agree with you, Dan, that we're not just doing the old kind of Judaism slightly differently. We are building something new that is not the same. So I'm excited to be envisioning that.
Yeah, when I was getting it ordained, they had the question was, what are you going to do about interfaith weddings? And then as you talk about the gate opening, I think at the time the question was, will you do them? And then it was, will you do them on Shabbat before the sundown? And then will you do them co-officiated? And then will you do it in a church? And it sort of keeps expanding what the question of what you will do, forgetting that maybe the orientation needs to be, what does the people need who I am serving? What's best for them to affirm them that when they think back about a positive time in their life, which hopefully is your wedding, and also a stressful time, that you'll say, when I was thinking about this, the exemplar who was going to hold my ceremony said yes to me, whatever that meant, and that worked with me to continue to affirm the life that I was living. And I think that if you were officiating a wedding, to find some kind of orientation around saying yes, and to whatever way the gate is opening. And if you're saying no to something, to know that maybe that's your stuff and not their stuff. As someone now who is in midlife thinking about getting married, our wedding is in November, we've thought a lot about what the role of witness is, what the role of family is, what the role of Judaism looks like. And, we're doing something out of the, I think, 270 weddings I've officiated that it doesn't exist yet. And that feels exciting and gate opening for myself too, of challenging myself, asking what are the different components of a wedding, who is there, and how can I open the gates for my heart a little wider about how I'm going to honor this moment in my life, or our lives, actually.
Yeah, first off, Mazel Tov, Miriam. We're really jazzed for you and for your partner and for your community and for everybody adjacent to you who is going to get to experience the most thoughtful wedding on the planet. I think you are going to be thinking through every last detail of that.
Thank you for saying thoughtful and not extra.
Extra thoughtful, thoughtfully extra. I hope it's all of those. But I want what you said to be true, that hopefully this is a joyous occasion. The fact that for the last few decades, talking about weddings in Jewish life, whether through think pieces or communal conversation, the fact that has been a big debate, that's appalling. That's sad. That stinks. And the fact that the first meeting that many clergy have with a couple about their wedding is a set of like, I don't know, alignment questions and like, well, is this going to happen? Is that going to happen? Are you going to cross this line? Like, it should be, wow, you want Jewish to be present in your wedding ceremony. Like, there are people who are Jewish who don't want Jewish to be present in their wedding ceremony. They don't want it alongside Christian. They don't want it alongside Muslim. They don't want it alongside secular. They just want, for 6 minutes, somebody with a Universal Life Church card, which I happen to have, but somebody who did a 10-minute, ordination online to give a nice speech that is not religiously layered at all, and then have a really raucous celebration. Like, it's an honor. It's beautiful that people are looking to connect Judaism to that ceremony. We come from a tradition that kind of assumed that would be the case, and I think took it for granted. It shouldn't be taken for granted.
Yeah, wow, Lex, I never really thought about it that way before. The idea that weddings in the Jewish community over the last decades have been like an issue, a problem, as opposed to just a celebration, and that we're moving into a time, hopefully, where it'll all be celebration. Like, that's the note I want to end on. I mean, that feels like, one of these conclusions to a religious ritual where we say, next year, and we're in Jerusalem, whatever, next year, weddings will just be celebrations. So, wow.
One note before we close out this episode and reflect a little bit is that we have our mini courses, our Elul mini courses, the final month of the Jewish calendar year being Elul, and we have 3-week mini course options in the Onion Yeshiva where you can learn with us, unlearn with us. Learn more at judaismunbound.com/classes, where you can register for any of our 4 different options. We have a class about Elul, the month. We have a class that I'm teaching about Kol Nidre, the Yom Kippur declaration. We have a class about Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism. And we have a class related to the binding of Isaac. So you don't want to miss them. Head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more. And we wanted to say about this episode that we just recorded, this got real, y'all. One thing we've tried to be as an organization, I talk about this in like basketball terms, like player coach or point guard, like somebody who is not just an authority, like a coach on the sideline, but somebody who is putting themselves into the equation. Like, I think Dan, Miriam, and I all in different ways try to bring ourselves into this work and not distance ourselves like, oh, I'm going to try to be professional in the Judaism Unbound space and me and my personal life. Like, we get real and we bring ourselves to this. It's very intense sometimes, but like, I'm grateful to share it with all of you as listeners. So if you have any responses, questions, visions based on this episode, please be in touch with us. There's a wide variety of ways for you to do that. You can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, judaismunbound.com, check out our show notes from this episode and from other episodes, all our other resources, lots of goodies. You can donate to us. We really appreciate that. It will make a difference in building the world that we're talking about. And you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. We're so beyond grateful to have you as our listeners. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.